welcome to the No Bullshit Property Podcast, brought to you by Cert Property.
I'm Howard.
And I'm Paul.
And after the brief hiatus in our podcasts, today we're going to be discussing heritage in celebration of World Heritage Day, which is the 18th of April. So, we're going to be talking about all things heritage and how that impacts delivery of projects, management of projects and various other things.
But before we get started with this episode, just a quick reminder to check out our previous episodes to give you the inside track on the ever-growing build-to-rent sector and our unique approach to community building and property management.
Paul, do you want to give us an update on the market news?
Yeah, I feel like we're in a new season. A new backdrop.
Yeah, whole new us.
So I think from a management perspective, and we talked quite a lot last year about, quite a lot of the last 18 months to 2 years about the rising energy prices and how that was affecting the cost of living, it was affecting lettings, how tenants had much greater awareness of energy now and that was helping them or dictating where they lived, I guess. So on the 1st of April this year, we've actually seen a 12% drop in electricity prices. So the good news is they are finally dropping. That's on the standard tariff, which is dictated by the price cap. The price cap changes every 3 months, and the majority of households are on the standard tariff now. It's expected to fall again the next quarter, which is even better news. So we'll see how that plays out in terms of the cost of living, how tenants are picking properties. I think, regardless of the fact that it's fallen, there's still going to be such a great awareness of of pricing for energy, and that's not going to change. And we've talked quite a lot before about sustainability still being at what remains and will more so be at the forefront of people's minds and how they can use electricity more efficiently going forward.
I mean, over the last 2 years, have we really seen tenants' letting decisions being driven by energy costs?
I think it's been a mix of a few things, really. You know, we've certainly seen people priced out of the cities, and that's been driven by not just an abundance of things, higher rents, higher taxes, and higher energy being a big one, really, because that's almost been the biggest increase of the lot. I do think it will. Will it make things a little bit more affordable for people? Possibly in the short term. But I think it's here to stay, the mindset that people now have on energy. You know, if we go back pre-COVID times, did anybody really consider the tariffs, or, you know, was that a factor in when you were looking for a property? I don't think so. But it certainly is now, and I don't think that'll go away.
Be interesting to see what you say. Okay. And in other news?
Well, I'm interested to learn a bit more about the changes in permitted developments.
It's a big change and a big piece of news, really, that the government reintroduced the permitted development rights to convert offices into residential. And this is something that it hasn't gone away entirely, but the government a couple of years ago changed the rules so that it was only on smaller buildings, but now it applies to a much wider range of office buildings. Why is it significant? It means you don't have to go through what these days is often a lengthy planning process. So in terms of what you just said, people getting priced out of a lot of cities because rents are rising, that is often because there's a shortage of stock and there's more people per apartment than there is apartments available. So it means that hopefully the delivery of new homes can be speeded up because you don't have to go through often a lengthy planning process. So it's a really important thing, certainly for us as developers, in terms of being able to get on site and deliver projects quicker. It's important for tenants because it means that, as I say, new homes are going to be delivered quicker. Hopefully it has an impact on the shortage of housing stock in the market. When it was last announced as widely as it as it currently is, it did have a kickstart to development. And
when was it last announced?
I can't remember exactly the year, but it was as we were coming out of the last financial crisis. So again, a sort of similar point in the economic cycle where the economy is trying to recover, and this time from the external shocks and the rising inflation, and it did help. So hopefully it has the same effect again. So a really positive thing, but it ties in nicely to our topic today as well, because obviously if you're getting a quicker route through the system to convert properties, then you're going to convert them rather than knock them down and look to rebuild them, which fits into nicely to our topic of heritage.
Yes.
And the different forms of heritage there may be.
So today is World Heritage Day, so what does that mean, you ask?
I did.
So it's a celebration, it's a day around the globe to celebrate different histories and heritage. It's a day to focus on the assets that we have and how we can preserve them for future generations, and how we can learn from them. And it's really something that's been put together to help communities around the world celebrate their different heritages and have an eye on how, as I say, how we can preserve what's been left to us by generations before, I guess. There's two types of heritage, tangible and intangible.
Okay.
So tangible heritage is what we can see, what we can touch, buildings. Intangible heritage is, I guess, cultures, but it's things that exist intellectually. So it can be songs, celebrations. So I think this was quite a new thing to me, World Heritage Day. So how are you celebrating it?
I mean, we celebrate heritage day in, day out in what we do. A lot of the developments we brought forward and a lot of the buildings we manage are heritage buildings. And I think the thing that jumps to mind when you say heritage in a property context, someone says a heritage building, and what do you think of? It's, the buildings that are probably 200, 300 years old. Certainly around Manchester, it's the old mill buildings and the buildings of industrial heritage. But actually, I think heritage goes a lot further than that. That's the initial thought that I have. Or older buildings like Georgian, other Victorian buildings. But actually, there's heritage in more recently constructed buildings, and I think this is where permitted development ties into this discussion. We're sat in a 60s building, and we've converted other 60s buildings, and many people look at those and think that they're ugly, but they represent a time and place in our history and the style of architecture that, like I say, many people think is ugly, particularly the 60s brutalist architecture. That's still part of our heritage, and these buildings have features that, like I say, mark a moment in time that we think we should try and protect and reuse.
Do you think people's views on heritage has changed over time? So you mentioned then about buildings being considered ugly. Do you think over time that viewpoint changes and people start having a greater respect, if you will, for, it's sometimes things at the time aren't appreciated, I guess that's the right word.
Yeah.
We don't appreciate things at the time, and then we look back on them and see them differently. Do you think that's the case?
I think so. I think, again, putting it from a property context and a building context, something that's built modern, you don't like all of them, but you look at something and go, oh, that's modern, that looks cool. And then it kind of goes through a bit of a cycle where, 10 years later, kind of like, that's not really on trend anymore. It doesn't look as cool or modern because, tastes and design and technology have moved on. Then it gets a bit older still, and then it starts to become heritage. It starts to become interesting again. And I think that's kind of the stage that we're at now, where we've been thinking 60s buildings are cool for almost 10 years now, but I think a lot more people are looking at them and going, oh, actually no, I do appreciate some of the design features. I think 80s and 1990s buildings are still in that grey stage where they're still too close to being modern that you can't appreciate them, but not old enough yet for people to go, oh, I see that they identify with a particular age and type of design. So yeah, I think they kind of go through a bit of a cycle.
It seems strange, doesn't it? I mean, we come into buildings as developers and rip things apart and expose all these amazing original features, and you just wonder why they were ever covered up in the first place.
Yeah.
But it's it's the fashion of the time, isn't it? And what's considered to be cool or aesthetically pleasing, which is
And I think as well, like I say, the buildings mark a moment in time that they were built. I mean, Hilton House that we're sat in now, as I say, a 60s building, and when we came in and uncovered a lot of the features that had been covered up with more modern interventions that were seen to be more cool and on trend at the time, we uncovered beautiful parquet flooring. But there's also that intangible heritage that's captured by the buildings as well. So everyone's listening. Where near the entrance, where we uncovered the parquet flooring, you could see all these like dents in the floor. And at first we were like, what's this? And I can't remember who actually sort of hit upon it and went, hold on, this must have been where the reception desk was. And there will have been a receptionist sat here wearing probably stilettos. And all of those dents are from the heel on the stiletto where they've been kicking their heels underneath the desk. And that's capturing the intangible heritage of that moment in time where a woman was expected to turn up to work wearing high heels or stilettos or something like that. So there's so many stories that the physical can capture. Beyond just the physical design matching the moment in time and the taste of that moment in time. So yeah, heritage all around us.
I love that. So what about some of the projects that we've done? So we've done quite a few heritage projects over the last 10 years. Which one are you most proud of?
Most proud of? I think all of them we've tried to balance protecting heritage with the constraints of modern building regulations or budgets as well, cost constraints, particularly relevant right now in a high cost, high inflation, high interest rate environment where budget constraints are tighter than ever. But we've always tried to capture as much of the heritage as we can. I mean, we delivered a scheme called Kinetic, which was, I think that was a 70s office building off the top of my head. But again, we stripped it all back, and there was a concrete slab in there, the ceiling, and it's what we call a waffle slab because it looks like a waffle iron. It's got all these curvatures in it, and that was done at the time when it was built to save money because you didn't have to pour a full slab of concrete. You'd be pouring, these bits that jut down and then the bits that are stuck up. As long as you did it the right way, you'd still have enough structural integrity. So it was a way to save money. But we uncovered it and thought, actually, that looks cool. But at the time, the location where the building was, the market wasn't particularly strong at the time as well, coming out of a financial crisis. We had to cover that feature up, unfortunately. So whilst there's that balance between trying to protect heritage features, you're still also grappling with this budget cost. So we're always trying. But the ones where we've been able to celebrate the heritage the most have probably been the office schemes that we've delivered. Again, like I say, you've got the constraints, building regulations is a big constraint to protecting and celebrating a lot of heritage features. Quite often in residential buildings, because of the building regulations, you've got to cover them up to meet fire compliance or noise or whatever regulations comply with. offices, you've got a bit more flexibility. So Hilton House, where we're sat now, I think is one that we're incredibly proud of, because we were able to expose and celebrate a lot of those heritage features. The parquet flooring I mentioned earlier, again, a cost-saving measure at the time, probably because they spent all their money on the parquet flooring, was to do this terracotta ceiling that you can see above, which these terracotta tiles were far cheaper to do than alternatives. But exposing that, and as tastes change, it looks great. We had opportunity to expose the tiled facade and clean that up and celebrate it. So that one, incredibly proud of. Similarly, in Liverpool, Duke and Parr, which was 3 different heritage buildings in one, and each one had different features. And again, as we went through the process of stripping that out, we were uncovering different things. Like we still found the original Victorian wallpaper, which again we've managed to restore and leave uncovered and celebrate, along with all the other beautiful features of the building. So I think the office schemes we've delivered, because of the lower constraints, have enabled us to celebrate the features more. But I'm proud of all of them, because with every building we've done that's an existing building, as I say, we've tried to protect the features and celebrate them where we can, even if they weren't necessarily seen as heritage, as I was saying before.
Do you think you get more credibility as a developer for restoring heritage sites or building things from new? And I know we've done a bit of both, so what's been the reaction from the media, from the public?
I think there's a big cultural support in the UK of protecting heritage. It's seen as the right thing to do, to a greater extent here than a lot of other places around the world. So I think naturally people like to celebrate reuse of existing buildings, heritage buildings again, how far does heritage extend, than other places in the world. And it's interesting because obviously we've done quite a lot of work overseas as well, seeing the difference in tastes, and again it relates to heritage and culture, and going out to the Far East or the Middle East, and if you put a brand new glass tower side by side with a mill conversion residential scheme, probably a lot of people from the UK would look at the mill conversion and go, that's my preference, that's where I prefer to live, that looks a cooler project, whereas someone from the Middle East or Far East would look at that and go, that's old, it should have been demolished. And actually it's the glass tower that I would prefer to live in, or I think is a cooler or more relevant project. So I think, in the UK though, we do celebrate our heritage, and that extends to the buildings that we live in and want to live in, and therefore I think you get more accolades or more respect, or almost, for reuse of existing structures. And that now has taken a step further because of the carbon element of it. Obviously we're aiming to be net zero carbon as a society over the next few years, and that can only be achieved by reusing existing structures right here, right now, because of the carbon output of developing from scratch, from ground up. So for that reason as well, I think over the next few years there's going to be even more focus on retaining existing buildings, and that takes me back to the point I made earlier, is how far do you sort of stretch the concept of heritage within these buildings.
Interesting. I think that brings us nicely to how you then manage the buildings, live and work in them going forward. And I think one of the biggest challenges I have is maintaining and managing a heritage building ongoing, because it does bring different challenges, and it's like you said then about people in the Middle East, and they much prefer the new stock and the technology, and that can be very challenging to incorporate into a heritage building. It does have limitations, but you also have restrictions with planning, with heritage, with UK heritage, and some of the challenges that I come across in living and working in those spaces is, we talked about at the start of the episode, the energy efficiency. That's a major one, and if you can, in certain buildings, can you insulate heat the same? Can you be as efficient as you can in a new build building? I think another big one is what tenants want. So you talked about people in the UK especially being drawn to those older buildings, and they absolutely are. I mean, I think back in the day looking for property, and it was all like exposed brick, find exposed brick, live in a property with exposed brick, and then you did, and it was freezing. But tenants want to be in those spaces, but they also have demands, modern day demands. And to be able to incorporate that and manage everything together is hard. Office buildings that are in old mills come with the challenges. You have, a lot of the time you have things like roofs that are hundreds and hundreds of years old that get affected by weathering. But your tenant expectation in there is still to provide a building that's, well, obviously secure, but there is some things that are completely beyond your control. We do, a lot of challenges are posed by that ongoing, and I think we're in quite a unique position where we do develop this stock, but then we do manage it ongoing for years to come. So, we do see it all through.
And surely the energy point that you were talking about before is one of the most difficult ones to balance if there is more focus on retaining the existing buildings, heritage or otherwise. It's how do you balance that focus on energy efficiency and energy costs from tenants with these older buildings, and the costs that go with bringing them up to standard, and the viability of all of that.
And as you said, there is a massive cost in building and maintaining these buildings, but you might not be able to offer the same sort of grade A products that you can in a new space. However, that doesn't alter the rent. You still need to achieve the same rents because the cost has been the same. So it is really, putting that whole proposition together. One of the ones that I'm most proud of, and you touched on it, is Duke and Parr, because in Liverpool, because I think we've got a tenant in there, an international video games company, and to see them in a space where they've really juxtaposed the old with the new, it's really quite incredible going in, and it's is really something. It does really give you that wow factor. And I think as well, that's talking about reuse of these heritage buildings. You mentioned it there, is you've got constraints in terms of actually the building fabric, but also you need the support as well of English heritage conservation officers in terms of how you can deal with that building. And I think Duke and Parr in Liverpool's a really good example of an approach where heritage has been clearly wanted to be celebrated by the developer, and the relevant statutory body has supported that, whereas in some instances elsewhere you find that actually there's just a complete stonewall approach taken, and well, no, we're not going to let you intervene and add that modern element in, give that juxtaposition. We just want it all completely as it was, which is almost impossible to make a building functional and useful if someone takes that approach. I mean, I'll give an example of a building we both looked at yesterday, and there was a comment by the owner when we saw the roof, and there was all these missing tiles and cracked tiles, and he said that, well, the heritage officer won't let us repair the roof effectively because there's
leaks coming in, water coming in because of these missed tiles. And we were like, what do you mean? He said, well, they've asked us to replace the tile exactly like for like with the same tile, and it just doesn't exist in terms of the colour of the slate, and therefore we can't actually repair this building because the heritage officer is saying it needs to be an exact match to protect the heritage. And I think that is an instance of it going too far, but it is important, talking about those constraints with heritage, to be able to balance and also be able to make those meaningful interventions to make it a modern and useful space to live or work.
Absolutely. So going forward, are we in danger of running out of buildings to restore?
I don't think we're in danger of running out of buildings to restore. I think we're in danger of putting ourselves in a very difficult position in terms of the costs and the sort of where the bar's set in terms of regulations, and that's not me saying regulation should be lower in terms of building regs. It's just me saying there's market pressures where costs are high to hit the energy efficiency, the soundproofing levels that are currently being sought. It's really difficult, and it makes viability really difficult. So there's the buildings there. It's that balancing between keeping the heritage and preserving the existing structures, but making them, as I say, functional for modern use. So I think it's quite the opposite. I think we might see that there's a few buildings out there that actually do lay vacant for a while because of the challenges of actually restoring them. And this is heritage or non-heritage, as I was saying before. We're getting to an era now where we're starting to look at 90s buildings and redeveloping them. And as I was saying, you still look at a 90s building and kind of go, ooh, most of them are a bit fugly. They're not the prettiest of era of architecture. A lot of them, particularly the commercial buildings. And again, we looked at a building yesterday, and it's like, do you actually have to knock it down and start again? Which seems ridiculous for a building that's so young, where we're converting and restoring buildings that are hundreds of years old. But it comes to that viability point. To take something that was built in the 90s, as recent as that was, the building regulations were so different to what they are today that actually some of them do need to be knocked down, or are more viable to be knocked down than they are to be restored. So I think, to answer your question in a more succinct way, there are plenty of buildings, but it's the viability, and actually, are they viable to be restored versus to be knocked down and rebuilt?
Right. Well, maybe the buildings will follow suit to the music that's back.
Well, maybe 90s buildings are making a comeback soon.
And I think before we finish, we've got to get in about Peeler's Yard, which is, we started on site in Peeler's Yard, one of our developments, earlier this year.
Yeah.
And I love telling this story because firstly it's in my neighbourhood, but secondly I think it's something that people of Manchester just don't know, but Peeler's Yard is actually set in the old police station.
Yeah, it was a police and fire station actually, in New Cross, which was one of the most sort of lawless areas of inner city Manchester back in Victorian era. And yeah, this one, we've got a beautiful heritage structure that we're retaining and celebrating. But again, that has had its challenges, and challenges in viability, to find a way to make it viable to keep this structure. It's like almost like a Venetian style tower, which was a chimney, and actually it was built as a sign of strength for the original police station, a sign of dominance over this lawless neighbourhood, to kind of mark out, we're here, we're the police, and we're going to control this area. So yeah, it's a work in progress, but it's going to look great when it's done.
And do you know why it's called New Cross?
Go on, you tell me.
It's called New Cross because the police station was situated there because it was where all the gangs of Manchester crossed the threshold.
I didn't know that. It's basically our own gangs of New York. It's much cooler because it's Mancunian.
Great. Well, World Heritage Day.
Yeah.
I think certainly learned a lot more, and continue to
celebrate heritage where we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us for our podcast.
Yeah, if you would like to learn more about what we do and our property management services, have a look on www.zertproperty.co.uk. Also, all our previous podcast episodes are available on all your usual podcast platforms. See you next time.